A newspaper lies open upon a wooden table. The headline reads, President criticized for policy failures. Hermann Erik Müller stares at it, his hands frozen mid-gesture. In the Third Reich, such words would have meant death. May 1945. Bavaria, a Wehrmacht propaganda officer, surrenders to American forces. This is the story of a man who spent years crafting lies for a dictatorship, only to discover truth behind barbed wire. Before we continue, if you find these forgotten corners of history compelling, do consider subscribing. It truly helps us bring more of these stories to light. The 8th of May 1945. The roads of southern Bavaria churned with defeated soldiers. Hermann Erik Müller walked amongst them, his Wehrmacht uniform dust-covered, his leather satchel containing the last propaganda leaflets he would ever create. The weight of that satchel felt different now. Not the burden of paper and ink, but the accumulated weight of years spent shaping reality into fiction. He had joined the Wehrmacht propaganda department in 1938. 7 years that felt like a lifetime. His speciality had been print media. Leaflets dropped over enemy lines, articles for military newspapers, carefully constructed narratives that painted the Reich as invincible, its enemies as subhuman. He had been good at his work, too good. Joseph Goebbels himself had once complimented a series of anti-Soviet posters Müller had designed. The memory brought no pride now, only a hollow sensation in his chest. American troops found him on a country road 3 kilometers outside Munich. He raised his hands without resistance. The young American lieutenant who processed his surrender spoke broken German and chewed gum whilst filling out forms. Müller noticed the casualness of it all, the absence of rage or brutality. He had written dozens of articles describing American soldiers as savage barbarians. The lieutenant offered him a cigarette. The transport ship departed from Bremerhaven in late May. 600 German prisoners packed into the hold, heading west across the Atlantic. Müller found a spot near a porthole where thin light penetrated the gloom. Around him, men spoke in whispers about what awaited them in America. Rumors circulated. Some said the Americans would use them as slave labor. Others predicted summary executions. Müller said nothing. He had crafted too many lies to believe anyone anymore. The voyage took 12 days. Müller spent hours watching the ocean through that small porthole, the endless grey water reminding him of the propaganda films he had helped script, vast, impersonal, consuming everything. On the 6th day, an older officer named Werner sat beside him. Werner had been a schoolteacher before the war. What did you do? Werner asked. Propaganda, Müller replied. Werner nodded slowly. So you were one of the ones who told us we were winning, even when we were losing? Müller had no answer. The ocean rolled past the porthole, grey, endless, indifferent. They arrived at Camp Ritchie in Maryland on the 2nd of June, 1945. Müller's breath caught as the lorries passed through the main gate. He expected guard towers with machine guns, electrified fences, perhaps the same brutality he had witnessed in camps back in Germany. Instead, he saw wooden barracks painted white, a football pitch, men playing cards at outdoor tables. The American colonel who addressed their group spoke fluent German. His name was Davidson. He was perhaps 40 years old, spectacles perched on a narrow nose, carrying the demeanor of a university professor rather than a warrior. You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, Davidson said. You will be treated according to international law. You will receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter. You will work, but you will be paid for your labor. You will have access to reading materials and recreational activities. Müller listened for the catch, the hidden threat. There was none. Davidson continued for 20 minutes, outlining regulations and expectations. The tone remained bureaucratic, almost boring. No screaming, no threats. No violence. That first night, lying on a clean cot with a wool blanket, Müller stared at the ceiling. The barracks held 50 men, and the sound of breathing filled the darkness. He had spent 3 years writing about American cruelty, about camps where German prisoners were tortured and starved. The dinner that evening had been beef stew with potatoes and bread, more food than he had seen in the final months of the war. The cognitive dissonance created a pressure behind his eyes. The revelation came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into his captivity. An American sergeant named McCarthy distributed newspapers to the barracks, real newspapers. The New York Times, the Washington Post, Stars and Stripes. He placed stacks of them on tables in the common area and then left without comment. Müller approached the nearest table. His hands trembled slightly. Other prisoners gathered round, cautious, uncertain. Werner picked up a copy of the New York Times, dated the 19th of June, 1945. "It's in English," someone muttered. "I can read English," Müller said. He had learnt it as part of his propaganda training, studying enemy publications to understand how to counter them. He opened the newspaper. The front page featured articles about the occupation of Japan, negotiations at the United Nations conference, and, his eyes widened, a lengthy critical analysis of President Truman's handling of post-war reconstruction. The article used words like misguided and inadequate. It quoted senators who openly challenged the president's decisions. It presented opposing viewpoints from different political parties, but it cited experts who disagreed with official government policy. Müller read the same paragraph 3 times. His stomach dropped. In the Third Reich, such an article would have resulted in the immediate arrest of the writer, the editor, and probably the publisher. The newspaper offices would have been shuttered, the printing presses destroyed. Everyone involved would have faced the People's Court. But this was printed legally, published openly, distributed to prisoners of war. "What does it say?" Werner asked. Müller looked up, his voice cracked slightly. "It criticizes the president." "What did you mean, criticizes?" "It says his policies are failing. It quotes his opponents. It presents evidence against him." The men round the table fell silent. Someone laughed nervously. "That's propaganda. They're testing us." But Müller knew propaganda. He had created it for 7 years. Propaganda had a texture, a smell, a specific construction. It repeated key phrases. It avoided complexity. It presented enemies as monsters and leaders as infallible. This article did none of those things. It was nuanced, detailed, filled with specifics and citations. It acknowledged multiple perspectives, and this wasn't propaganda. This was journalism. If this contrast shocks you as much as it shocked Müller, then you understand why these stories matter. Do consider subscribing. We uncover more forgotten history each week. Colonel Davidson began weekly seminars in July. Attendance was mandatory for all officers. The topic: democratic institutions and the role of the free press. Müller sat in the second row of the camp's makeshift classroom, a converted warehouse with folding chairs and a blackboard. 40 German officers filled the space, most wearing expressions of skepticism or boredom. Davidson stood at the front, chalk in hand, and began to draw. "Democracy requires 3 pillars," he said, sketching 3 columns. "Executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch. But there's a 4th pillar, unofficial but essential." He drew a 4th column. "The press. We call it the 4th estate." He turned to face them. In a democracy, the press doesn't serve the government. It serves the people by holding the government accountable. Müller's jaw clenched. He had spent 7 years doing the exact opposite, making the press serve the regime, using it to shield leaders from accountability. Davidson continued. "A free press publishes information the government doesn't want published. It asks questions the government doesn't want answered. It investigates corruption, challenges policy, and provides citizens with the information they need to make informed decisions." An older prisoner, a former colonel named Steiner, raised his hand. "But doesn't that weaken the state? If citizens constantly doubt their leaders, how can a nation remain strong?" Davidson smiled. "That's the paradox. A government that can be questioned becomes stronger, not weaker. Why? Because problems get exposed and fixed before they destroy the system. Citizens trust institutions more when they know those institutions can be challenged and reformed." He wrote on the blackboard, "Free press equals self-correcting system." Your government, Davidson said, controlled all information. It presented itself as infallible. But we know how that ended. The system couldn't correct itself because no one was allowed to identify problems. The press served the state instead of truth. So the state became divorced from reality. Müller felt heat rising in his face. Every word struck like a hammer. He had been part of that machine. He had helped the state maintain its grip on reality, had crafted the illusions that prevented self-correction. The sessions continued twice weekly through August and September. Davidson brought in American journalists to speak. One was a reporter from the Baltimore Sun named Helen Kowalski. She was perhaps 35, wearing a simple grey suit, her manner direct and professional. I've criticized 3 presidents, she said. Roosevelt during the war, Truman now, and before that, Hoover during the Depression. I'm still here, still working, still publishing. Why? Because in America, journalism isn't treason, it's patriotism. She looked directly at Müller, though she couldn't have known his specific role. Propaganda tells people what to think. Journalism gives people information so they can think for themselves. Propaganda serves power. Journalism serves truth. After the session, Müller approached her. His English was heavily accented but functional. Question, he said. If you write something false, what happens? Kowalski's eyes narrowed. I get sacked. My newspaper loses credibility. I might face a lawsuit. My career ends. Not arrested. Not unless I've committed an actual crime. Libel is a civil matter, not criminal. And there's a high bar for proving libel, especially regarding public figures. The burden is on them to prove malice and falsehood. Müller absorbed this. So the consequence is professional, not political. Exactly. My editor holds me accountable. My readers hold me accountable. Other journalists hold me accountable. Not the government. And if you criticize the wrong person, someone powerful, Kowalski smiled thinly. Then I'd better have my facts absolutely right. But if I do, I'll probably win a Pulitzer Prize. The camp library occupied 2 rooms in the administration building. It contained perhaps 2,000 books in German and English, plus current subscriptions to American newspapers and magazines. Prisoners could visit during designated hours, checking out up to 3 items at a time. Müller became a constant presence there. He read the New York Times every day, cover to cover. He studied the Washington Post. He requested books on American history, journalism ethics, and democratic theory. The camp librarian, a middle-aged civilian named Dorothy Sullivan, noticed his appetite for material. "You're the propaganda officer," she said one afternoon in September. It wasn't a question. Müller looked up from a book on the First Amendment. "Yes." "Colonel Davidson told me. He thought you might be interested in some specific materials." She handed him 3 books. The first was by Walter Lippmann, titled Public Opinion. The second was Freedom of the Press by George Seldes. The third was a collection of Supreme Court decisions related to the First Amendment. "Why are you giving me these?" Müller asked. Sullivan's expression remained neutral. "Because Davidson thinks you're genuinely trying to understand, not just going through the motions. And because understanding how it got things right might help Germany work out how it got things so wrong." Müller spent the next 3 months devouring material. He learnt about the Zenger trial in 1735, which established the principle that truth is a defense against libel charges. He read about the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 and their eventual repeal. He studied the Sullivan decision's establishment of actual malice standards for defamation cases involving public figures. Each page forced him to confront his own role in the Reich's propaganda machine. He began keeping a journal, writing in German in a notebook Sullivan provided. The entries grew darker as his understanding deepened. 3rd October 1945. I read today about Joseph Pulitzer and yellow journalism. The Americans had their own era of lies and manipulation in the 1890s, but they corrected it. They developed ethical standards. They created journalism schools. They understood that a free press could become corrupted by market forces and sensationalism. So they built institutions to counter that corruption. We did the opposite. We took a free press and deliberately destroyed it, replacing journalism with lies. And I helped. 17th October 1945. Werner asked me today why I spend so much time reading American newspapers. I told him I'm trying to understand how they won. He laughed and said they won with tanks and aeroplanes, not newspapers. He's wrong. They won because their citizens could trust their institutions, because their press told them the truth, even ugly truth. So they understood what they were fighting for. We lost because our citizens couldn't trust anything. By 1945, even true information sounded like propaganda because we had poisoned the well. 2nd November 1945. Colonel Davidson gave a lecture today on the difference between information and propaganda. He said, "Information adds to knowledge. Propaganda replaces knowledge. Information acknowledges complexity. Propaganda reduces everything to simple narratives. Information respects the audience's intelligence. Propaganda treats the audience as children to be manipulated. I have spent 7 years treating Germans as children. I have reduced complex geopolitical realities to simple lies. I have replaced knowledge with poison. There is a word for what I am. The Americans are too polite to use it. Collaborator. 7th December 1945. 4 years after Pearl Harbor. The camp held a memorial service for American servicemen who had died in the war. Prisoners were required to attend. I stood in the back row as Colonel Davidson read names. The list seemed endless. Thousands of names. Young men who would never return home. The winter air bit at exposed skin. The sky hung grey and low. After the reading, Davidson spoke. "These men died fighting tyranny," he said. "Not fighting Germany, fighting tyranny. There's a difference. Some of you were soldiers who followed orders. Some of you were true believers in the Nazi cause. Some of you were opportunists who saw a chance for power. It doesn't matter now. What matters is what you do next." He paused. The assembly remained silent. Germany will need to rebuild. Not just buildings and roads, institutions, trust, democracy. And democracy requires informed citizens. It requires a press that serves truth, not power. Some of you will return home and rebuild the same authoritarian structures that led to this war. Some of you will return home and build something different. The choice is yours. Davidson's eyes swept the assembly. For a moment, Müller felt the weight of that gaze directly upon him. After the ceremony, Müller walked alone to the far corner of the camp grounds. A fence separated the prison from a field of bare trees. He stood there for 20 minutes, hands in pockets, breath clouding in the cold air. Werner found him there. "You're thinking too much," Werner said. "I'm thinking exactly the right amount," Müller replied. "What will you do when we go home?" Müller turned to face him, his voice cracked. "I destroyed truth. For 7 years I destroyed truth. I took facts and twisted them. I took photographs and altered them. I took human suffering and turned it into propaganda. I made Germans believe lies. And now they've lost everything because they couldn't see reality." Werner said nothing. "So I'm going to spend the rest of my life building what I destroyed. I'm going to create a newspaper, a real newspaper, one that tells the truth no matter how uncomfortable, one that holds power accountable, one that treats readers as intelligent adults, not children to be manipulated. They'll never let you. The occupation authorities, they won't trust a former propaganda officer to run a newspaper." Müller's jaw clenched. "Then I'll start small. A newsletter, a pamphlet, anything. But I will do this, because if I don't, what was the point of any of this?" He gestured at the camp, the fence, the bare trees beyond. "I spent 7 years as an instrument of lies. I have, however many years, remained to become an instrument of truth. It's inadequate compensation. It won't undo what I did. But it's all I have." Werner studied his face for a long moment. "You've changed. I've woken up. There's a difference. A quick note. If you're finding this journey as powerful as we do, subscribing really does help us tell more of these stories. Now back to what happened next. February 1947. Müller returned to Germany on a transport ship packed with repatriated prisoners. The country he found bore little resemblance to the one he had left. Cities lay in ruins, millions displaced. The occupation authorities controlled everything. Germany had been divided into zones, each governed by a different Allied power. He settled in Stuttgart, in the American zone. The city was perhaps 40% destroyed, rubble cleared into neat piles along reconstructed streets. He found a room in a boarding house run by a widow named Frau Kemper. She asked no questions about his past. Employment proved difficult. His experience in propaganda made him radioactive to legitimate publications. The new German newspapers, operating under occupation authority oversight, wanted nothing to do with former Reich propagandists. He worked construction for 6 months, clearing rubble, rebuilding walls, earning enough to survive. In the evenings, he wrote. He filled notebooks with articles about propaganda techniques, about how the Reich had manipulated information, about the mechanics of mass deception. He wrote analyses of specific propaganda campaigns he had participated in, explaining the psychological manipulation behind each. In August 1947, he approached the editor of a Stuttgart newspaper called the Schwäbische Zeitung. The editor's name was Thomas Brenner, a former journalist who had been sacked by the Nazis in 1934 for refusing to join the Reich press chamber. Müller laid his notebooks on Brenner's desk. I was a propaganda officer for 7 years. I know how the system worked because I was part of it. Germans need to understand how they were manipulated so they never fall for it again. Let me write about it. Brenner's expression remained skeptical. Why should I trust you? You shouldn't, but you should read what I've written. If it's rubbish, throw me out. If it's valuable, publish it. Brenner spent 2 hours reading. Finally, he looked up. This is detailed, specific, uncomfortable. It's the truth. Truth from a liar. Müller didn't flinch. The best place to learn about lies is from someone who told them professionally. Brenner published the first article in September 1947 under the headline, How We Were Deceived, Confessions of a Propaganda Officer. It created immediate controversy. Some readers called for Müller's arrest. Others demanded more. The occupation authorities investigated, questioned Müller for 3 days, then permitted publication to continue. The articles ran weekly for 6 months. Müller explained the techniques of repetition, the use of emotional manipulation, the suppression of contrary evidence, the construction of scapegoats, the creation of alternative realities. He named names, including his own. He detailed specific campaigns and explained the psychological mechanisms behind each. Letters poured in. Some threatened violence. Others expressed gratitude. One came from a former schoolteacher in Munich named Elisabeth Hartmann. Your articles helped me understand how I was fooled, she wrote. I believed the lies. I taught them to children. Your honesty about your own guilt has given me the courage to face my own. Thank you. Müller kept that letter in his wallet for the rest of his life. In March 1948, Müller launched his own publication. He called it Der Freie Bote, the Free Messenger. It was 4 pages, printed on cheap paper, distributed in Stuttgart and surrounding towns. Initial circulation was 800 copies. The masthead carried a simple statement of principles. We serve truth, not power. We question authority, not to destroy it, but to strengthen it. We trust our readers to think for themselves. The first edition contained 3 articles. The first analyzed the new basic law being drafted for West Germany, explaining how its press freedom provisions differed from Weimar-era protections. The second investigated corruption in the local reconstruction authority, documenting how certain contractors received preferential treatment. The third was Müller's personal essay on why Germany needed a free press more than ever. The corruption article created immediate trouble. The implicated contractors threatened lawsuits. The occupation authorities questioned Müller's sources. He provided documentation, contracts, payments, witness statements. The investigation that followed resulted in 3 arrests and the termination of the corrupt contractors, circulation grew. By December 1948, the Freie Bote printed 5,000 copies weekly. By 1950, 20,000. Müller hired 3 additional journalists, all vetted carefully for their commitment to ethical practices. The newspaper covered local politics, reconstruction efforts, denazification processes, and the emerging Cold War. It criticized occupation policies when warranted. It praised effective governance when deserved. It maintained editorial independence from all political parties and interest groups. In 1952, the West German Press Council invited Müller to speak at their annual conference in Bonn. He stood before an audience of 300 journalists and editors. "I spent 7 years destroying trust," he said. "I helped create a system where Germans couldn't trust any information, couldn't distinguish truth from lies, couldn't hold their government accountable. The result was catastrophe. Now we have a chance to build something different, but it requires discipline. It requires ethics. It requires courage." He paused, looking out at the assembled faces. A free press is not free from responsibility, it's free from government control. But it must be bound by ethics, by professionalism, by respect for truth. If we abuse that freedom, we'll lose it. Germans have learnt that lesson the hard way. Let's not learn it again. The speech received a standing ovation. More importantly, it influenced the development of the German Press Code, adopted in 1956, which established ethical guidelines for German journalism. By 1958, Der Freie Bote had become one of southern Germany's most respected regional newspapers. Circulation exceeded 100,000. Müller was 53 years old, his hair grey, his face lined with years of intensity. He received an invitation to speak at Columbia University's School of Journalism in New York. The topic? From Propaganda to Press Freedom, Lessons from Germany's Transformation. Standing in that American classroom, looking at young journalism students eager to change the world, Müller felt the weight of his journey. He thought of that first newspaper he'd read in the prisoner of war camp, the shock of seeing a president criticized in print. He thought of Colonel Davidson's lectures, he thought of the years spent trying to atone for 7 years of lies. "I was a propagandist," he told the students. "I know every trick, every manipulation, every technique for shaping perception and controlling information. And I'm telling you, don't use them, not even for good causes. Because once you start manipulating truth, even with good intentions, you've crossed a line. You've decided that you know better than your audience what they should think. That path leads to tyranny." A student raised her hand. "But what if the truth helps bad people? What if honest reporting gives ammunition to racists or fascists or communists?" Müller smiled sadly. "You report the truth anyway. You trust your readers. You trust democracy. Because the alternative, controlling information for the right reasons, that's what I did. That's what destroyed my country. The moment you decide you can manipulate truth for good purposes, you've become what you claim to fight." The Columbia speech was published as an essay in several journalism reviews. It became required reading in journalism schools across America and Europe. Müller's transformation from propagandist to press freedom advocate became a case study in moral reckoning. But Müller himself never used that word, redemption. In private conversations, he remained harsh about his past. "I helped destroy a nation," he told Werner during a visit in 1962. Werner was teaching again, at a gymnasium in Hamburg. They sat in a cafe, drinking coffee. Two old men looking back on extraordinary lives. "You've spent 20 years trying to fix it," Werner said, "inadequate. 20 years of truth doesn't erase 7 years of lies. The people who died because of Nazi propaganda, my work contributed to their deaths. The families destroyed, the children orphaned, the civilization nearly annihilated. I played a part in that, a small part perhaps, but a part nonetheless." Werner stirred his coffee. "Then why continue?" "Because stopping would be worse. If I stop, then those 7 years define me entirely. If I continue, then at least I die trying to balance the scales, even knowing they can never be balanced." Hermann Erik Müller died in 1973 at the age of 68 of a heart attack whilst working at his desk at a Freie Bote. He was editing an article about the importance of investigative journalism in democratic societies. The newspaper continued under new leadership, maintaining the principles he had established. His obituary in the New York Times, written by a journalist who had met him at Columbia, captured the complexity of his legacy. Hermann Erik Müller spent 7 years telling lies for a dictatorship and 25 years telling truth for democracy. He never claimed the second erased the first, but he proved that even those who have betrayed truth can dedicate their remaining years to serving it. The newspaper he founded still publishes today, its masthead carrying the same principles he wrote in 1948. We serve truth, not power. If you've stayed with us through this extraordinary journey, you're exactly the kind of person we create these for. Please do subscribe. It truly helps us continue. In the end, Müller's story is not about redemption, it's about recognition. Recognizing the difference between propaganda and journalism, between manipulation and information, between serving power and serving truth. It's about the painful journey from one to the other. Undertaken not because it was easy or because it erased past sins, but because it was necessary. The free press he encountered as a prisoner of war shocked him because it contradicted everything he had been taught and everything he had practiced. But that shock became an awakening, and that awakening, painful and incomplete though it was, changed not just one man's life, but contributed to the reconstruction of an entire nation's relationship with truth. Hermann Erik Müller surrendered to American forces in May 1945, carrying propaganda leaflets. He died in July 1973, surrounded by newspapers committed to factual reporting. The distance between those two moments, measured not in years, but in understanding, represents one of the most fundamental transformations a human being can undergo. Democracy, he learnt, is not just about votes and laws. It's about information, about trust, about citizens who can distinguish truth from lies because they have access to a press that serves truth rather than power. He spent the last decades of his life teaching that lesson, writing about it, living it. His example remains relevant. In any era, in any nation, the temptation exists to control information, to shape reality, to manipulate truth for political ends. Müller's life stands as both warning and inspiration, warning about how easily professionals can become instruments of deception, inspiration about the possibility of choosing a different path. The newspapers he read in that Maryland prisoner of war camp shocked him into understanding. The understanding transformed him, and the transformation, imperfect though it was, helped rebuild a shattered nation's relationship with truth. That is legacy enough for any life, even one that began by serving lies.